Might Guy and the 3rd Raikage are two of the strongest physical powerhouses we see in the entire series. Guy is easily the greatest taijutsu specialist in the history of Konoha, and the 3rd Raikage was so strong that his defense was considered to be completely impenetrable. But what would happen if this immovable object were to collide with the unstoppable force that is Konoha's Blue Beast? That's what I'll be going over in this video by pitting the 3rd Raikage while alive and in his prime against various forms of Might Guy, from his base all the way up to the 7th gate. And since I'll be scaling multiple versions of Guy throughout the video, I think it's best to begin with how strong the 3rd Raikage is. Starting off with his lore, the Raikage was known to consistently restrain and reseal the Eight Tails with the help of the other Cloud Shinobi whenever it rampaged in the village. There was one time where the Raikage tried to restrain the Eight Tails without any help, and it resulted in a stalemate, which people have used in the past to argue that the 3rd Raikage is equal to Gyuki, but this takes the fight completely out of context. My main issue with this is that the 3rd was fighting with the specific purpose of resealing the Eight Tails, which means that he didn't have any lethal intent. And Gyuki even notes that the 3rd managed to chop off all of his tails prior to collapsing. So, considering that the 3rd Raikage managed to completely slice through Gyuki on 8 separate occasions, but never hit a vital spot, I think it's fair to say that he was probably going out of his way to avoid them, which is why it's very flawed to argue that he's just an 8 Tails level combatant. And this is further backed up by the fact that after the 3rd Raikage was sealed during the 4th Great Shinobi War, Naruto says that Gaara is now the shinobi who has the best shield since he's gone. This means that the Raikage's lightning armor is more durable than Gaara's sand defense, which is insane because during the 5 Kage summit, Gaara's sand could take a direct hit from the 4th Raikage and multiple shots of Sasuke's Inferno style. This means that the 3rd Raikage should be able to tank extremely powerful attacks. And what makes this even crazier is that his one finger hell stab is stronger than his defense, which is the reason why Naruto's Shadow Clone was able to beat the 3rd by redirecting it back at him. So, if the 3rd's defense is already too strong for the 4th Raikage to break through, and he can be taken out by his own hell stab, it implies that the 3rd Raikage is physically stronger than the 4th overall. This is extremely impressive because the 4th Raikage could break through Sasuke's skeletal Susanoo, chop off the horn of the Eight Tails, and is even stated to be the strongest Cloud Shinobi in the 4th databook, which should include Killer Bee, at least before the war arc. I do think things start to get very contentious during the war itself though, because Bee straight up overpowers the 4th Raikage when they fight over whether or not Jinchuriki should be able to participate in the 4th war, with Weekly Shonen Jump noting that Bee surpassed his brother. But the fact that it says B surpassed A in this moment still implies that prior to the war, the Raikage was stronger than him, which is consistent with the fact that the 4th still has to hold back when fighting alongside B earlier in the series. This is particularly important because even prior to the war, B was still the perfect Jinchuriki of the Eight Tails and could wield its full power. So the fact that the 3rd Raikage is not only stronger than the 4th, but also B by extension, should mean that he's far surpassed the Eight Tails on its own. In terms of speed, the 3rd Raikage also does very well for himself because he could avoid the chakra arms of a KCM1 Naruto Shadow clone, with Naruto noting that the Raikage are always super fast while having a flashback to the 4th. This is pretty good stock for the 3rd Raikage being in the same speed tier as the 4th. And even though I would definitely side with the 4th Raikage being the faster of the two, the 3rd was still quick enough for Naruto to compare them despite having witnessed the 4th's top speed. One last thing that I think is worth mentioning before we get into the matchup is another jutsu that the 3rd Raikage was well known for, which is Black Lightning. Even though this jutsu was hyped up as dangerous in the 4th data book, it's hard to say how useful it would be against Guy, since the only time we got to see it used is when Darui shocked the White Zetsu, which aren't particularly durable. Of course, if the 3rd Raikage were to use Black Lightning, it would be much stronger since he is a more powerful shinobi, but the problem is that the jutsu itself doesn't have any notable feats, meaning we've got no idea if his Black Lightning is strong enough to affect shinobi on Guy's level. Now that we know how strong the 3rd is, it's time to get into the actual matchup, starting with base Guy versus the 3rd Raikage. This might seem ridiculous to even discuss at first, but I will say that one area where Guy can absolutely keep up is speed, specifically when he's using his nunchucks. In real life, a report on the DOJ's official website places the speed of nunchuck attacks at 150 miles per hour, which is over 3 times faster than the fastest punch ever recorded. And while this may sound silly, I genuinely believe that this same discrepancy would apply to Guy as well, since he was capable of keeping up with White Mask Obito exclusively while wielding his nunchucks. When Obito is about to grab KCM Naruto and take him into the Kamui dimension, Guy was able to stop him by swinging at his head to force a mutual strike. And this is the start of a pretty lengthy exchange where neither of them could get an upper hand. Guy goes for a second nunchuck attack that Obito blocks with his gunbai, and when Obito throws kunai back, Guy deflects them successfully. Then, Obito decides to temporarily switch his main target from Naruto to Guy, stating that he'll take Guy in his dimension first. But Guy is able to pull off another mutual strike with his nunchucks to prevent this from happening. And, to put the cherry on top, after they pass through each other, Obito throws his gunbai at Guy's back, yet is countered once again by Guy without him even looking, which Naruto acknowledges as a nice move. So, when Guy is using his nunchucks, he should be able to keep up with characters that are relative to KCM Naruto in speed, with the only real counter argument being that Obito was just stalling the squad without going all out, since he had already summoned the Geto Mazo in order to resurrect the Ten Tails. But this doesn't change the fact that Naruto would have been grabbed by Obito if not for Guy intervening, which means that Guy's attacks with the nunchucks are just fast enough to intercept attacks that can tag KCM Naruto. But specifically in base form, the main thing Guy would struggle with in a fight against the 3rd Raikage is simply not having enough raw power. We see in the beginning of the war that a weakened Kisame was able to take an elbow from base Guy without bleeding or receiving much damage, despite the fact that right before this, KCM Naruto was able to hit Kisame so hard that he coughed up blood. This is particularly relevant because if you look at the Japanese version of Naruto vs. the 4th Raikage, Naruto says that it would be really bad for him to take a direct punch from the 4th, who wasn't even at full power yet. This means that if you are under the interpretation that the 3rd Raikage is physically stronger than the 4th, which is something I agree with, then Guy has no way to realistically damage him. So, the only way Guy could possibly win this is through a battle of stamina, which would be a possibility for base Guy in almost any other fight, given that he trained to do hundreds of laps at a time, even as a kid. However, given that the 3rd Raikage could fight an army of 10,000 shinobi for 3 days straight, I think this is a rare instance where even without the strain of the gates, Guy still doesn't have the endurance to outlast his opponent, which means that the third Raikage should be able to beat Guy pretty confidently due to the massive gap in power between them. That being said, this dynamic completely changes once Guy opens the 6th gate, which brings us to round 2. When he's actively using the gates, Guy should have a pretty clear speed advantage over the third Raikage, even without any nunchuck shenanigans, since he could save Kakashi from one of 10-Tail Madara's truth-seeking orbs, which should make him extremely quick, since they're even faster than Kamui. This is also consistent with how earlier in the series, when Guy first saw Kakashi using Kamui, he says that he's a worthy rival, creating a narrative that Guy can generally fight on this level. Considering Obito was able to enter the Kamui dimension before Naruto could hit him, Guy should be in that KCM1 Naruto range of speed at the very least, as opposed to the third Raikage, who is only relative to a Naruto clone. I wouldn't say that Guy can outright blitz the third Raikage, since he was still compared to the fourth, as I mentioned earlier, but just know that Guy does have a very concrete speed advantage at this point. Plus, the power boost that Guy gets from the 6th gate is massive, since he could contend with the Six Tails' ninjutsu using a Sakujaku and stalled it for a decent amount of time while the rest of the squad was occupied with Obito's other Jinchuriki. Keep in mind, since Obito had direct control over the Biju themselves, it's likely that the paths were straight up perfect Jinchuriki, which is supported by them all being capable of partial transformation, because Kisame says pulling that off makes someone worthy of being known as the epitome of Jinchuriki. This means that 6th Gate Guy was taking on a fully transformed perfect Jinchuriki by himself, suggesting that he might potentially be capable of competing with the third Raikage at this point. If you want direct scaling between Guy and the Raikage, we see that a Sage Mode Naruto Shadow Clone can crack the Raikage's arm through his lightning armor. So that should roughly be the bar you have to clear in order to harm him. This is important because we see that Obito was able to straight up tank a larger Rasengan from KCM1 Naruto, who should be more powerful than a Sage Mode Naruto Shadow Clone without even bruising. Yet, unlike the Rasengan, Kakashi's Lightning Blade was capable of completely piercing through Obito's body. And we see that when 6th Gate Guy and Kakashi are fighting the V2 Jinchuriki together, his punches actually perform very similarly to Raikiri, in terms of both speed as well as their ability to swat the tails of the Jinchuriki away. If you follow this line of scaling, then 6th Gate Guy should be able to hit harder than KCM1 Naruto's Rasengan, which is supported by the fact that even while using the lower gates, he could casually shatter Yagura's coral palm that Naruto's chakra arm couldn't break. So, 6th Gate Guy should be capable of harming the third Raikage through his lightning armor, although it is worth noting that the Raikage's arm only seemed to take moderate damage from the Rasengan, meaning it would likely take multiple strikes from Guy to put him out of commission. This poses an issue because the 6th Gate puts significant strain on Guy's body, which is the reason why he spent a lot of time fighting Obito in base form. And if Guy isn't able to defeat the Raikage fast, he might run out of stamina before he can win. You could argue that Guy would think to redirect the Raikage's attack back at himself to win in one shot, just like Naruto did. But the issue with this is that Naruto had conversations with both the third Raikage's official attendant as well as Gyuki before coming to the conclusion that the Raikage can damage himself. So I think it's pretty ridiculous to say that Guy would come up with the same strategy on his own. On the other hand, Guy also doesn't have the durability feats to prove that he can survive a direct hit from the Raikage's one-finger hell stab, especially since even Kabuto considers it to be an invincible attack, despite having seen a lot of the strongest shinobi in the world firsthand. This means that even though the third Raikage is slower than Guy, he might actually have a bit more wiggle room in this fight, since he should straight up win if he lands a single attack, as opposed to Guy, who would have to land numerous strikes to wear the Raikage down in order to defeat him. I think it's super reasonable to side with either the Raikage or Guy in this battle, but I do personally lean towards the third Raikage winning while Guy is in the 6th gate. Mostly due to Guy's stamina issues and the fact that he can't afford to get hit a single time. But things do get shaken up significantly in the last round, since 7th gate Guy is one of the most overpowered characters in the entire series. This is because Guy's signature move, the Hirudora, was able to send Madara Susanoo flying, and in my opinion, likely dealt a significant amount of damage to him. This might sound baseless because we don't get to see Madara until after the explosion ended, which means that on a surface level, it's impossible to say whether it did damage or not due to the Edo Tensei's regeneration. However, I do think that Guy did manage to harm Madara regardless, because while the explosion from Hirudora was still going off, B says that the wood-style jutsu Madara used on him earlier had gone weak, and casually breaks out of it. This implies that Guy not only blasted through the Susanoo, but also did enough damage to Madara for the wood style that he was maintaining up until that point to lose its power. Keep in mind, it took a combo attack from the 5 Kage to break through a lower stage of Madara Susanoo, and even then, they didn't significantly damage him through it. So, Guy's Hirudora should be just as strong, if not stronger than multiple Kage combining their powers to deal as much damage as possible. If you personally don't subscribe to this idea, Guy does have a major strength advantage over the third Raikage regardless, since as I mentioned earlier, he should be strong enough to deal a decent amount of damage to the third while only using the 6th gate. So, when you take the massive power jump to the 7th gate into account, which Guy describes as being so large that the 6th doesn't even come close, he should be completely out of the third Raikage's league. And when 7th gate Guy pulled up on Madara, his taijutsu was so strong that Gaara considered his movements to be non-human, despite the fact that he's seen the third Raikage's Hell Stab, which is also taijutsu, and didn't have a reaction even close to this, implying that Guy is just on a much higher level. Due to this, I think Guy would be capable of beating the third Raikage pretty handily with the 7th gate, since at this point, the power gap between them is likely big enough for Guy to defeat him regardless of his bad stamina. Thanks for watching. If you want to watch another video by me, make sure to check out this one, where I talk about Nagato versus Kabuto. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Later!